In the early 2010s, John Baker was being taught by and mentoring under legendary deep wreck and cave diver Joe Citelli. Citelli was extremely passionate about diving, and even more passionate about teaching others. At one point, spending over 40 days of straight cave diving just simply because he loved to teach and took any opportunity he could to get into the water. Baker had been diving with Citelli for some time, but still needed to finish up a few things to complete his closed-circuit trimix course. This included a dive to a depth of around 230 feet. With Citelli being local to Florida and depth being a necessary tick box for the course, the two opted to complete the dive out of Pompano Beach in the southern part of the state. This dive was stacking up to be like any other dive that the two had previously completed together off of the coast of Florida. The weather was beautiful, the skies were clear, and the current was strong, which was fairly normal for this area and type of diving. Loading up the boat that day, Baker and Citelli both realized that they were the only two technical divers on board. A technical diver is someone who pushes beyond the recreational limits established by diving training agencies. Generally, this includes a dive time that does not require decompression, a max depth that does not exceed 130 feet, and the ability for that diver to ascend directly to the surface in the event of an emergency. Technical divers, on the other hand, will generally go deeper, incur decompression obligations, and use specialized equipment and breathe specialized gas mixtures for diving to those deeper depths. Now, having recreational divers on board wasn't necessarily a problem, as the duo decided to execute something known as a split drop. With this technique, a dive boat will drop recreational divers off at their dive location and then take the technical divers to their dive site, wrapping back around to get the recreational divers once their dive is complete, and finally collecting the technical divers once they've completed their decompression obligation. After the dive boat had dropped the recreational divers off at a very shallow reef, it took Baker and Citelli out to deeper water with depths in excess of 200 feet. The two technical divers informed the dive master that their run time would be around 110 minutes, and they splashed in. Due to the very strong current, which is normal for this area, the two decided to do a hot drop, which is where they remove all of the gas out of their buoyancy compensator in an effort to descend as quickly as possible. This is to avoid the current taking them too far away from the location that the boat dropped them in. After executing a very quick and successful descent, the two arrived at their planned depth on the bottom of around 230 feet, gave each other the universal OK sign, and began their dive. They weren't planning on diving any specific shipwreck or reef. They were simply looking for the depth for Baker's course. But what they descended into, in the hours following this descent, became an unforgettable memory for the duo. It wasn't long after they began their dive that they realized that they were not alone at the bottom of the ocean. They had descended into a group of sharks, but these weren't any sharks. They were bull sharks. Initially, they seemed curious, but as the dive went on, the sharks became visibly defensive, putting their fins down in an aggressive posture. Eventually, the sharks began very quickly swimming toward the divers, only turning at the last second. At this point, the duo knew that it was time to abort the dive. Calmly and collectively, the two began their ascent by launching two very large 6-foot pink DSMBs. These are effectively balloons that can be deployed from depth that will stand up at the surface to signal to boats that there are divers in the water. However, Baker and Citelli were not in the clear. They had a decompression obligation. Going directly to the surface could result in embolism, paralysis, or death. They had to spend time off-gassing at specific, gradually shallower depths to avoid getting decompression sickness. But the sharks had followed them up. There were 4 bull sharks circling the dive team, periodically charging and turning at the last second, even bumping their fin tips. Unable to ascend, Baker and Citelli went back to back, unclipping their decompression bailout tanks and using them to create distance between them and the sharks, and also to push them away and bump them when necessary. This occurred for the entirety of the decompression obligation. One can only imagine the relief that the two felt finishing their final decompression stop and being able to surface. However, the sharks were still there, and upon breaking the surface, the two began to feel a very painful stinging on their face. The pain was caused by extremely heavy rain, accompanied by thunder and lightning. The divers had surfaced into a whiteout storm. Divers could hear boats extremely close to them, but none of them were visible, so the thought of being run over by one of these boats began to enter their minds. Luckily, they had their surface buoys that they had shot, and in an effort to become more visible, deployed a second backup surface buoy as well as their lift bags. With the storm raging, rain pelting their face, and the engines of boats roaring in the distance, all while being surrounded by sharks whose dorsal fins would periodically break the surface like in a movie, Citelli turned to Baker and said, "All we need is fucking snow." For the next hour and a half, carried by the current, the two men floated helpless in the open ocean, taking turns periodically to sink beneath the surface to keep an eye on the sharks that had been relentlessly following them this entire time. By the time the storm blew over, the pair had drifted miles, almost reaching Boca Raton. Eventually, and well over 2 hours since the two began their descent, the dive boat found them, crediting their many inflated surface buoys, and stating that they almost decided to call the Coast Guard. Luckily, both men survived and went on to form a very strong bond and share many years of diving together. John and Amanda Baker, both advanced rebreather divers, instructors, prodigies, and practically family to Joe Citelli, operate Scuba John's Dive Shop in Lexington, South Carolina. This story, videos, and photos come courtesy of the Bakers, so please take some time to check their shop out and reach out to them if you need any type of training. John and Amanda were my rebreather instructors, and they are fantastic. Joe Citelli unfortunately passed away earlier this year, but leaves a legacy as a renowned wreck and cave diver. Joe was a great person who would give anybody the shirt off his back. He was in Tom Mount's first IANTD Trimix class, was a MEG instructor trainer, and served as the chairman of the National Speleological Society cave diving section. I hope you enjoyed the story. I know the first time I heard it, I did. If you want to hear more stories, please make sure to comment below, and also please like, share, and subscribe. You've been listening to Vince with Flippers and Goggles. I'll see you in the next video.